I think it's worthwhile sometimes when you're reading the 18th century to realize that while you're studying English literature, it may not be a bad idea to make your associations with American literature, with French literature, with Spanish literature, and with Portuguese literature. Because what we are getting, of course, is a British point of view, and we're understanding the ways in which the English people and the land of the British Isles have influenced America. But who are the people who cross over from ocean to ocean? We know that the evangelist Whitefield preached in England and London. He preached in Georgia and in the Americas. We know that Benjamin Franklin was very much influential in the French court. And we know that he was a member of the English Hellfire Club when he visited London. If you don't know anything about the Hellfire Club, see the movie that Tom Cruise was in. The title of the movie where he visited a club in disguise where they carried on various orgiastic rites. Eyes Wide Shut, right. I think the music is by one of the Beatles. But that's the Hellfire Club in the 18th century. That's where they got the story. And Benjamin Franklin was a member of this famous club. You may not know very much about the club. They actually, a number of England's leading politicians visited the Hellfire Club. It actually was a ruined monastery in England where politicians and others would carry out orgiastic rites. They would dress prostitutes as nuns and bring them in and carry out various such rites. One of them was Sir Francis Dashwood, the head of Parliament, and the other was John Wilkes, his opponent in Parliament, who supported the American Revolution. They both visited the Hellfire Club, so did Benjamin Franklin. And at one time in Parliament, Sir Francis Dashwood became irate with Wilkes and said, "I don't know, sir, whether you will die of hanging or the pox," in opposition to his policies. Wilkes' reply was, "That depends, sir, on whether I embrace your principles or your mistress." Now, what we're going to do is talk about a much more serious and much more involved understanding, and that is we're going to look at the narrative of Alauda Equiano. Equiano was a black who lived from 1741 to 1740 to 1797. I'm sorry, 1745 to 1797. He was brought into slavery. When he was transported to England, he gained his freedom. He was then enslaved by unscrupulous slavers who refused to adhere to his manumission papers. He finally found his freedom and became one of the spokesmen for the Abolition movement, which was a very strong movement even at the time that he spoke. Now, what I want to do is look at a calendar of Equiano's conduct, and then we're going to discuss it. First of all, this calendar comes from this book. The interesting narrative of the life of Alauda Equiano, written by himself. It's edited by Robert Allison. It's published in the Bedford series in History and Culture in 1995. You have only chapter 5 in your book, and he has 12 chapters, actually. What I'm going to do is try to survey a good bit of his statements to find out what he was saying, what he was thinking, what motivated him, how he endured the problems that he confronted. And it's worthwhile to understand the nature of the slave trade. We have discussed it. And I mentioned to you when we were discussing Orinoco that within a 5-minute walk of the University of Houston, you have a slave museum which has slave utensils, tools, chains, cotton bales, artifacts of the slave trade. And one has to understand literally how brutal it was, how many people affected, what it meant to the religious compromises of this nation, and what it meant to the people who themselves were slaves. I would like to say that this is past history, but there are countries in this world where people are enslaved. There are, in fact, United States citizens who are abducted into slavery, taken into Middle Eastern countries. Every once in a while you read, quite often, and too often enough, you read of people trying to get to America from Latin America, from Mexico, who are stashed in trucks, given very little water. If they survive that trip, and we see enough who have died in these habitats, in these vehicles, if they survive, then they're sequestered in apartments or in houses where they literally are treated as slaves. They have no liberty and they have no freedom to move about. When they earn wages, these wages are cheated of them. And whatever they earn, they can keep. Whatever is stolen from them, they can protest because they have no status. So whether we are talking about slavery in the 18th century, a legal, legitimate slave program, or an illegal slave program in the United States, illegal sequestration of immigrants, or if we're talking about slavery as it exists actually in countries where young children are already put into servitude, we're not very far from recognizing the suffering that many people undergo in today's world. Now, from this book, I have this calendar. I want to look it over fairly briefly and pick out some high points. From 1741 to 1750, we learned that there were 53,600 Africans transported to the New World each year. And these are Africans who were either engaged in tribal warfare in their own country, abducted by the victors in these tribal warfares, forced into forts established by the Royal African Company, and then sold when the ships came by to pick them up. They were not looked upon as human beings, they were property. And what people picked up were tobacco, sugar, fruits, mahoganies, slaves, and they're all the same in one category. This is trade. Captains of ships received a percentage of the goods that they delivered. And so it's very, very unusual, although we read of slave ships that are overcrowded and a lot of deaths. A lot of captains simply needed to preserve their slaves so that they earned a profit and didn't lose their profit. Although we'll see that Equinos exposed an insurance scam when the ship Zhong drowned a large number of prisoners who were already sick in order to collect insurance. And this is one of the very celebrated cases of the slave trade. Oluwade Equinos was born in Isek in Nigeria. My impression is that this is Igbo country. The Igbo always had a reputation of being quite sophisticated and quite educated. We know he's educated because he can pick up languages very quickly. Now, if you are illiterate in your own country, or illiterate in any country, you cannot pick up languages easily in another country. But if you're educated in your country and you know the concepts of language, then the transference of the concepts to other words is a mechanical operation and relatively easy. From 1751 to 1760, 52,900 Africans transported to the New World each year, according to the account books. These are not genealogical tables. These are account books. If you want to know what the Port of Houston ships out every year to every country in the world, all you have to do is call them, tell them what country you'd like a printout, and they will list all the products and all the goods that they send out. And if this were in the 18th century, slaves would be counted among the goods being sold. They wouldn't be considered passengers on the ship. We do find, and although Quakers kept slaves, toward the end of the century, Equinos particularly praises the Quakers who not only treat their slaves well, but then seek the abolition of slavery. And so when he moves to Philadelphia, he's very adamant about finding himself amongst Quakers and not among others who might deceive him. In 1756, in Africa, he talks about the fact that his sister, that there were marauders who used to come into their compound and grab prisoners and take them off into slavery. You used to have people who would sit in the trees and who would warn others that these marauders were coming in. And on one occasion, Equinos saved his sister from attack and from an ambush. But then on another occasion, both he and his sister were captured, separated. And while at first he thought he could get back to his homeland, pretty soon he found himself very far from the inland, looking at the ocean, and for the first time realizing how desperate his case was as a slave and how distant he was from any land he really knew. He describes this in the text, and we'll talk about it. 1756 to 63, the 7 Years' War occurred. And in 1757, during that time, Equinos was bought by Michael Henry Pascal, a British naval officer who named him Gustavus Vasa and takes him to England. And Gustavus Vasa was the name of a celebrated Swedish hero and king. Equinos serves in the British Navy, finally is baptized at St. Margaret's Church in London. Now, he saw others being baptized. He asked to be baptized. And the problem, of course, as I mentioned earlier when I discussed the slave trade in Orinoco, is that the obligation of all Christian sects was to baptize anyone who was not Christian. This was part of the mission, part of the role. The issue, of course, was if you baptized someone and he became part of your religion, if you followed the Bible, you must free your slaves after 7 years. This is automatic. Well, slaves were too expensive to be freed. And consequently, as I've mentioned before, the fact that the soul had been saved was one achievement. The question of ownership and slavery became simply an economic concern, and it was up to the owner how to handle the issue. Some owners paid their slaves a small amount. Some owners, in most cases, when they were too old for either the slave or themselves to help each other, they gave their slaves freedom. From 1763 to 66, Equinos worked for Robert King in Montserrat. That's in the Caribbean. And Equinos himself trades between the West Indies and the mainland American colonies. Now, he was a very bright fellow. We're going to look at some of the details. And he discovered that as the whites were trading, would purchase goods and then trade them for a profit, he himself could do it. Because he was bright and because the captains who hired him and the people who worked with him needed him, and at some point found him so invaluable that he even steered a ship at a time when both the captain and the mate were too sick to do so. They allowed him on some occasions to purchase items and then resell them at a profit. And he knew how to make a profit. He became a businessman. On occasion he was deceived, and I'll mention that at one point the captain had bought a number of bulls, and for his effort gave Equinos 2 bulls that he himself could own on his own. But when it came time to loading the ship, there wasn't enough room, and Equinos was forced to forego the bulls he had. He was pretty bitter about the fact that while the white slavers were earning a profit, he himself was not. Under these circumstances, however, the ship wrecked, and the bulls died, and the captain died, and consequently whatever providence may have interfered prevented any of them from making a profit. But when you're dealing with a person's personal diary, the diary of Equinos, you're dealing with a remarkable ability to retain information, and people are really complimentary and amazed that Equinos was able to keep track of all the captains, the ships he sailed on, and the various produce he was involved with. At times, of course, he was not permitted to write, because this only empowered a slave, and slaves weren't given power. In 1765, by the way, put him in perspective. He was born in 1745. Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743. So they're contemporaries. In Savannah, Equinos hears George Whitefield preach. Now, at some point, we discover the art of preaching, and he has discovered the art of preaching. Toward the end of his autobiography, he wants to go to Africa in order to conduct missionary work. And he asks the Bishop of England, Bishop Lowth, to provide papers allowing him to gain ordination and then to preach. He expected ordination, he hoped to have it, but then the British authorities ruled against it, primarily because they weren't sure what his strengths were, what his capabilities were, and the fact that he was black meant, of course, this was a most unusual situation. In 1766, July 11th, Equinos buys his freedom. He discovered that he could gain his freedom with 40 pounds. And so he worked. And we'll see as we look through this autobiography, he worked to gain these 40 pounds. When he almost had it, at some point, money was stolen from him. At some point, money that he had, goods that he had sold and expected payment for, were not paid. He found himself duped. He found himself deceived, and he found himself often dealing with dishonest white traders who knew, because he was a slave, that he could not protest in the courts against them. And consequently, you had incredible duplicity. In 1767, he was shipwrecked in the Bahamas, and in this situation, he was able to survive. We'll talk about that episode, but at one point, the sailors had to climb off the ship, out of the ship, and onto the rocks, bloodying their legs and their feet in order to try to get the ship off the rocks where they had been shipwrecked. We have a number of shipwrecks that Equinos is involved with, and that he miraculously survives. When he visits Savannah, Georgia, he finds that there's a black child that no one will bury. The minister will not even say a blessing over the black child because he's a slave, or at least not legitimately white in any respect. And Equinos takes on the role as minister, says the prayers, and buries the child. You get it's a very interesting spiritual invocation. You find Equinos, a man who is able to overcome every hazard and every difficulty, embracing his spiritual life. At one point, he's trying to investigate what his spiritual life is all about. He thinks he may be a Roman Catholic. He thinks he might be a Turk. He thinks he might be a Jew. And then he hears a sermon preached in church and realizes that he wishes to remain Anglican. But you find this person who comes from a foreign soil, who comes from a primitive land in terms of industrialization, who's always questioning, who's always being objective because he's forced to be. He finds so many examples of duplicity, as Orinoco found, among people who profess a native religion, an inspired religion, a gospelized religion, and then they practice duplicity, and they show that they are basically dishonest people. He himself regrets that on some occasions he can only follow 8 of the 10 commandments. He says when he's on ship, you just can't get away from swearing. So he has to do that. He says, and on some occasions when he's offshore, he finds that he can't celebrate the Sabbath, or he's not in a place to go to church. So on 2 occasions, he says at least he celebrates 80% of the 10 commandments. It's a kind of interesting perspective. But you see, if you're dealing with trade, if you're dealing with goods, if you yourself are chattel, then the percentage of profit you make or the percentage you earn always becomes a point of interest. And when Equinos talks about religious profit, he talks about how many shares you can get in this heaven that seems to surprise him and that offers some hope, although he prefers to have hope on this earth. Let's move on a little bit here. In 1768, Equinos sails to the Mediterranean, and you have a St. Patrick's Day slave uprising at Montserrat. This is among a number of slave uprisings in the Caribbean, and finally you have the slaves achieving their own freedom. In 1772, Lord Somerset had made established an important policy. Slavery, he said, cannot exist in England, and a slave setting foot in England is free and cannot be returned to slavery. Now, this is still many years before the slave trade is abolished in England in 1807. So you could have slaves in Portugal, you could have slaves in the Caribbean, in the Barbados, you could have slaves in the American colonies, but if they came to England, England would declare them free. At some point, we see Equinos going on an Arctic expedition. That's kind of interesting. People, he says, we're looking for the Northwest Passage, and he speaks about the animals he saw, the animals they slew, the difficulty of living in an Arctic climate. And you have to remember that many, many writers were fascinated by the Arctic regions at this point. You, of course, remember that Pym in Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is sailing into the Arctic region at the end. You remember that Frankenstein, the Frankenstein monster, raced into the Arctic regions, and Dr. Frankenstein was chasing him to try to kill him so that he would not murder any more of his family. And you remember that Melville in Marty, one of his famous novels before Moby Dick, has the major figure sailing into the northern climate. This was the unknown land yet to be explored, and Equiano gets to the Arctic. In 1773, the Massachusetts slaves also petitioned the legislature for emancipation. Now, they got it. There's no reason for slaves to be for slavery to be acceptable in Pennsylvania. In Massachusetts, it was followed by Pennsylvania and others of the mid-Atlantic states that put an end to slavery, wouldn't allow it anymore. Pennsylvania, because it was largely influenced by the Quakers. There are heartbreaks for Equiano. He had met a fellow on ship by the name of John Annis, who was a free man. He had gained his freedom. But he was kidnapped by his former master and taken to the West Indies into slavery. There he was tortured and put to death, flogged, tortured, beaten. Equiano himself dreaded ever the occasion that might cause him to be flogged. And on one occasion, he was suspended by ropes. You'll see the exhibits of this in the Slave Museum at the Pan-African Church on Martin Luther King Boulevard. He was suspended by ropes, so his arms held, his legs suspended so that he couldn't reach the ground. But John Annis was kidnapped. Equiano tried to get him freed, tried to get the courts to listen to him, tried to gain this free man back from the slave owner who had abducted him, and he failed to do it. And this became one of his great regrets in life, that he was unable to save the life of this particular man. In 1774, on October 6th, he heard John Wesley lecture, who had written about thoughts upon slavery. In 1774 to 76, Pennsylvania Quakers bar slaveholders from membership. And then we have the effects of the American Revolution. Equiano was in England for most of that time. In 1775, he was admitted to communion in Westminster Church in England. And then there's an interesting set of voyages we're going to look at. He went to Nicaragua, where he formed an alliance with the Mosquito Indians. The Mosquito Indians were the lone Indian tribe in Latin America that never submitted to the Spanish. And Equiano admired them for their independence. He didn't see a need to convert them because he felt that they had themselves a religion of some quality. And he went to Nicaragua to help Dr. Irving, who was one of his associates, one of the men who invited him to sail on ships with him. And then in 1776, Equiano left for London. We're going to drop down. In 1776, of course, the American Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal and considered slaves to be only a portion of the equal to a single white. Therefore, all men were not created equal. Well, if all men were created equal, they wouldn't give an equal measurement. But nevertheless, it was a major, major step. And the American Declaration of Independence is one of the great documents finally establishing the ultimate principles of Lockean philosophy, that all men have the capability to view, see, experience, and draw on those experiences in order to achieve whatever good life they desire. 1781 is an important event. This is the Zhong Massacre. And we'll spend a little bit of time looking on that. There was a disease on the ship Zhong, and a large number of sailors were sick. Some of them could survive, but a number of them died, and the captain of the ship, realizing that these others would die before he got to shore, decided that he's going to drown them. He put them all in chains, and 132 slaves were drowned, who probably would not have reached shore at all because of their illness, but the captain would not have collected insurance of people who died of natural causes. But if they had been drowned accidentally, he would. Crew members of that ship, white crew members of the Zhong, told Equinos the story, and Equinos pursued the conviction of the captain, and well, it wasn't exactly, he pursued the efforts to convict the captain, but of course the courts would favor the slave owners. And then in 1783, Equinos told the abolitionist Granville Sharp of the Zhong Massacre. The Quakers called on Congress to end slavery. And Massachusetts, which had already ended slavery, persisted in trying to have the American colonies ban the slave trade, although slavery, of course, wasn't banished until the Civil War. And that's because by the time of the Civil War, every slave was worth the equivalent of today's expensive cars, about $70,000. So if you owned 10 slaves and you were told to free them, you lost $750,000. If you owned 100 slaves, then you'd have to sell Microsoft. A number of works were coming out. The Methodists declared slavery contrary to God's law, and it gave all its members 12 months to free the slaves. The Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery passed. And the Equinos was in Philadelphia in 1785 to promote manumission of the slaves, which meant giving them their freedom. We see the abolitionist movement gaining strength at this point in England, in America. At one point he went to Sierra Leone, where Africans were setting up their own country. Slaves from America were returning to Africa to set up their own country. And while Equinos supported this, he also found that if there was corruption there, he would object to it. And he was finally he was forced to leave his mission to Sierra Leone because of his exposure of corruption. All right, we're not going to spend more time with the history, but look at what he has to say. By the way, in 1788, he did present an anti-slavery petition to England's Queen Charlotte, urging for the abolition of the slave trade. And let's see, 19 years later it occurred in England, but that's a decade. In 1789, he published this book. In 1790, it was printed in Dutch and other languages. And slave revolt in 1791 and 1803, significant. In 1792, April 7th, he married Susan Cullen and gave birth to a child, Anna Marie Vasa. Then Johanna Vasa, another child born, 2 years later. his wife apparently died in childbirth at that point. Always resistance to the slave trade. In 1796, the House of Commons defeated a bill abolishing the slave trade. And in America, a Virginia law professor proposed a plan to end slavery in the United States by 1896. So he was willing to let it go another century. Equinos died on April 31, and that's what I just told you. And his daughter, born in 1793, died in the same year when she was 4 years old. All right. Now what I'd like to do is spend some time looking at ways to understand this novel in an orderly fashion. And I'm going to look at the Greases, which we've spent some time on, and you followed when you were doing your study of the Gentleman's Magazine. We won't be able to get through a lot of this, but we're going to look at what he says about government, what he says about religion, what he says about economics, what he says about art and aesthetics, what we find out about science and technology, what he informs us about education, and all the details he provides us about social living. And the acronym GREASES gives us some way to pursue our study. So I'm going to go through Equinos' book to give us some sense of the action he's providing. Now, in terms of being a writer, you could take the 12 chapters and see how he is dividing them, see where his emphasis is. But for the most part, we have a direct narrative without necessarily literary trope affecting the outcome. He is a skillful writer. I haven't looked at the original manuscript. I haven't looked at any of the first editions, so I can't tell you to what extent this text has been normalized. But that would be a study that some of you could do when you move into your master's program. Study the text of Equinos' book. He mentions early that he had lived in Africa, a part of Africa named Guinea. It extends 3,400 miles along the coastline from Senegal to Angola. He gives us a sense of the kingdom. The kingdom is divided into many provinces or districts in one of the most fertile areas of Africa. He tries to understand the nature of his people, the nature of his government. He says his father was an elder or chief. He held the highest mark. And how did he achieve this mark? A mark of the chief or the elder was conferred on a person by cutting the skin across the top of his forehead and drawing it down to the eyebrows, and then rubbing it so that you developed a thick wheal across the lower part of the forehead. Most of the judges and senators were thus marked, and he was destined to wear the mark of a tribal leader. Incidentally, African students on this campus who are here say that there's still 1,000 tribes in Africa and 1,000 different languages spoken. and the tribal influence. While we look at places like Zimbabwe as separate entities and Nigeria as separate entities, they are really compounds of tribal units. And we ought not think of them necessarily the way we think of our own nation, although we are actually a republic constituting states. He talks about the nature of defense of this government. He says traders bought European goods. When a trader wants slaves, he applies to a chief for them. This is the way the government works. He tempts them with his wares. In order to get priests, in order to get prisoners and slaves, the tribes have to fight amongst themselves. And how do we fight? We fight with firearms, bows and arrows, broad two-edged swords, javelins. We also have shields which cover a man from head to foot. All are taught the use of weapons. Even our women are warriors and march boldly out to fight with the men. Our whole district is a kind of militia, he says. Our whole district is a kind of militia. On a certain signal given, such as the firing of a gun at night, we all rise upon arms against our enemies. So the idea of Minutemen prevailed in Guinea in his government, and we get some idea of how the government operated. He talks about how the government was run. He says, like the Israelites in their primitive state, our government was conducted by our chiefs or judges, our wise men and elders, and the head of a family with us enjoyed a similar authority over his household. The same is ascribed to Abraham and other patriarchs. He goes on again to describe what his culture was. He said his own father had numerous slaves, a numerous family, of which 7 of his brothers and sisters were able to survive to adulthood, myself and my sister, who was his only daughter. And then he talks about how at the age of 11, when he should have been entering the rites, he was kidnapped. And I've already told you how that happened. When he was forced into slavery, when he found himself no longer near his own country, when he saw the ocean for the first time, he finally wanted to describe what it was like to reach the Barbados. The Barbados was the heart of the English slave trade. He said, at last we came in sight of the island of Barbados, at which the whites on board gave a great shout and made many signs of joy to us. We did not know what to think. Many merchants and planters came on board. They also made us jump and examined us attentively. So they're looking to see how good products they have. We thought by this we should be eaten by these ugly men as they appeared to us. And when soon after we were all put down into the deck again, there was much dread and trembling. They didn't know how they were going to be treated. They thought they were going to be cannibalized by these men they had never seen. He arrived in England from the Barbados when he was 12 years old. I'd mentioned to you that the the 100 families of the newest rich in England in the 17th century were slave traders. Again, it was as though you had found a way to cut the cost of a computer by half. The wages of a indentured servant were $2.42 a day. A slave would work at $1.31. So now you outsourced your, it's not new, you outsourced your labor to people who would work at a much lower salary. You retained the same profit value, and therefore you increase your profit 100%. You get yourself very wealthy that way. Okay. He speaks about coming to England in chapter 4 when he's baptized. He says it was now between 2 and 3 years since I first came to England, a great part of which I spent at sea. So I became inured to that service and began to see myself happily situated. But when he comes, and he's very happy as a sailor, he sees no problems, but when he comes to England, he discovers amongst the people that he serves that he has a problem. Here he writes it. While I was attending these ladies, their servants told me I could not go to heaven unless I was baptized. And the whole idea of heaven and baptism now comes to him. And we're going to discuss that in a few moments when we return to the subject of religion. But I want to still view some of the points in this diary on the issue of government. In chapter 4, after his baptism, he says, I now thought of myself being freed and working for myself. He still hasn't learned how to read and write, and he literally sits with people in in England, to teach him how to read and write, and he's got certain people who really want him to read the Bible, and this is how he learns. He talks about the way that the problems he has without any liberty. He says, when he talks about government, there are shocking acts which make the West India Code quite bloody for slaves. He says, slaves work in the field like beasts of burden. And he speaks about one French planter who peopled his plantation with his mulatto children. He would only allow his own children to work in the fields. And he had numerous sons and daughters who had come off black slaves who were working in the field. Says Equinos, I've often seen slaves, particularly those who were meager in different islands, put into scales and weighed, and then sold from 3 pence to 6 pence or 9 pence a pound. My master was shocked by this methodology. In chapter 6, he pulls no punches. He says, in the preceding chapter, I've set before the reader many instances of oppression, extortion, and cruelty, which I've been witness to in the West Indies. If I were to enumerate them all, the catalog would be tedious and disgusting. And he talks about various political situations where people were oppressed, sometimes killed, because they didn't follow the governance of the rulers whom they worked with. He says in chapter 6 that the plight of the slave was irreconcilable. He himself was within 1 minute of being tied up and flogged without either judge or jury when he tried to sell some goods to some white men, and they took the goods without paying him. He insisted on payment, and they were going to flog him. He ran away from them, but in that case, he again speaks about the nature of deprivation and the problem of governance. As we've seen, ultimately, he got his manumission. This is in chapter 7. He has enough money now to buy himself from slavery. And here's his discussion as he talks about how he's going to gain his freedom. He has to go to a legal office, to a government office, in order to sign papers of manumission. Accordingly, on that morning I went and met the captain, and with my money in hand and many fears in my heart, I prayed him to be as good as his offer to me, when he was pleased to promise me my freedom as soon as I could purchase it. The speech seemed to confound the captain. This is Equinos writing. He began to recoil, and my heart that instant sank within me. He knew he was going to back down. What, said he, give you your freedom? Why? Where did you get the money? Have you got 40 pounds sterling? Yes, sir, I answered. How did you get it? Replied he. I told him very honestly. The captain who he's with said he knew I got the money honestly and with much industry, and that I was particularly careful. On which my master replied, I got money much faster than he did, and said he would not have made me the promise if he had thought I could get the money so soon. So right away, you're in a situation where these people are prevaricating. Come, come, said my worthy captain, operating against the master, clapping my master on the back. Come, Robert, I think you must let him have his freedom. You have laid out your money very well and have received a very good interest all this time. And here is the principal at last. I know Gustavus has earned you more than £100 a year, and he will save you money. He will not leave you. Come, Robert, take the money, he says to the master. My master then said he would not be worse than his promise, and taking the money, told me to go to the secretary of the register office and get my manumission drawn up. These words of my master were like a voice from heaven to me. In an instant, my trepidation was turned into unutterable bliss, and I most reverently bowed myself with gratitude, unable to express my feelings, but by my overflowing of my eyes and a heart replete with thanks to God, I felt congratulations for this honor. And then he utters words from the 126th Psalm and moves on from there. Now, he does get a little poetic here. He says here he goes to the register office. He's going to get his papers. He says, I could barely believe I was awake. Listen to these rhythms. Heavens, who could do justice to my feelings at this moment? not conquering heroes themselves in the midst of a triumph, not the mother who has just regained her long-lost infant and presses it to her heart, not the weary, hungry mariner at the sight of a desired friendly port, not the lover when he once more embraces his beloved mistress after she has been ravished from his arms. All within my breast was tumult, wildness, delirium. My feet scarcely touched the ground, for they were winged with joy. And like Elijah as he rose to heaven, they were lightning sped as I went on. And now you get into the religious context of Equinos' tales. When you go into a discussion of the religion of Equino, what you have is a man who is strong enough ultimately to become a missionary, but skeptical enough of the way others worship religion, cheat him, deprive him of his fortune, go back on their promises, flog innocent people, enslave people different than they are. He's as much concerned about the hypocrisy of religion as Defoe might have been, as Swift might have been in the abolishment of Christianity. The novel becomes a stark commentary on how people who believe in religion don't understand its principles. And if the idea is that a little child shall lead them, or a simple slave shall interpret them, we have sufficient evidence in Equino's life to do a real study of the ways in which people rationalize their religion to achieve ends which obviate religious principles. I'll just pull out a few episodes here. He speaks about his sister who has been taken from him. He says, though you were early forced from my arms, your image has been always riveted in my heart, from which neither time nor fortune have been able to remove it. To that heaven which protects the weak from the strong, I commit the care of your innocence and virtue. If they have not already received their full reward, that is, has she been murdered, and if your youth and delicacy have not long since fallen victims to the violence of the African trader, the pestilential stench of a Guinea ship, the seasoning in the European colonies, or the lash and lust of a brutal and unrelenting overseer. Will heaven give her the peace that the people who are supposed to understand heaven don't give her? He's involved in a near shipwreck. No, I'm sorry. This is a different episode. A young man on ship swears. He says, when I was in the ship, an incident happened which, though trifling, I begged leave to relate, because I couldn't help taking particular notice of the judgment of God. One morning, a young man was looking up to the foretop sail. You've got the midsail. The foretop sail is the very top of the masthead. the mast. One morning, a young man was looking up to the foretop, and in a wicked tone, common on shipboard, damned his eyes about something. Just at that moment, some small particles of dirt fell into his left eye, and by the evening he was very much inflamed. The next day it grew worse, and within 6 or 7 days he lost it. So by damning God, by shouting into imprecations, God got his revenge on this sailor by forcing him ultimately to lose his eye. When he's sailing on the ship Namur, before he sails on the ship Namur, he is baptized. I had mentioned this to you briefly. Ladies had told him that he couldn't go to heaven unless he was baptized. So he communicated his concern to Miss Guerin, one of his tutors, a woman whose house he lived, and who was teaching him to read and write. I had become a favorite and pressed her to have me baptized, when to my great joy she told me I should. She had formerly asked my master to let me be baptized, but he had refused. However, she now insisted on it. So I was baptized in St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, in 1759 by my present name, Equinos. The clergyman gave me a book called A Guide to the Indians, and I moved about town. He says, the Miss Guerins used to teach me to read and took great pains to instruct me in the principles of religion and the knowledge of God. But it's some of the hypocritical passages that we get to, just as we find Orinoco deceived by the captain of the ship. He quotes frequently from Paradise Lost in this particular work. Here he talks about an Indian who had been tortured by the whites. A poor Creole Negro I knew well, who was transported from island to island, at last resided in Montserrat. This man used to tell him how he was cheated of his fishing. Sometimes when a white man take away my fish, I go to my master and he get me my right. And when my master by strength take away my fishes, what must I do? I can't go to anybody to be righted. I must look up to God mighty in the top for right, says Equinos. This artless tale, now remember, the man fishes, his fish are taken away by his master. He doesn't get paid for them. He gets no profit. Equinos goes into the Bible. He says, this artless tale moved me much, and I could not help feeling the just cause Moses had in redressing his brother against the Egyptian. So Moses had struck and killed the Egyptian, and Equinos is saying, if he had been there, and that master hadn't paid this man for his fish, he might have felt like killing him too. Of course, he might not have been able to escape. What is the problem of slavery? It denies charity. And Equinos gives us his philosophy. He says, it is this mistaken avarice, that is the nature of slavery, that corrupts the milk of kindness and turns it into gall. He says, and he talks about the issue of slavery in religious terms. He says, why had these men not been generous, tender-hearted, and just as they are now unfeeling, rapacious, and cruel? He said, surely this traffic cannot be good, which spreads like a pestilence and taints what it touches. Which violates that first natural right of mankind, equality and independence, and gives one man a dominion over his fellows which God could never intend. For it raises the owner to a state as far above man as it depresses the slave below it. Notice the isocolon of the sentence. It raises up as it depresses. He's now giving us rhetorical balance. He's giving us this artistic strength. Are slaves more useful by being humbled to the condition of brutes than they would be if they enjoyed the same privileges as men? No, when you make men slaves, you deprive them of half their virtue. You set them in your own conduct an example of fraud, rapine, cruelty. You compel them to live with you in a state of war, and yet you complain that they are not honest or faithful to you. You stupefy them with stripes and think it necessary to keep them in a state of ignorance, and yet you assert that they are incapable of learning, that their minds are barren soil, or if educated, culture would be lost on them. You claim they come from a climate where nature lets man scant and unfinished, incapable of enjoying the treasures she has poured out for him. By changing your conduct and treating your slaves as men, every cause of fear would be banished. You wouldn't have to have them turning against you or moving about against you. When he is getting the missionary zeal, he has dreams and visions. First of all, sailing, this is in chapter 10, sailing in the good ship Hope, a ship bound from London to Cadiz in Spain. He says, I heard the name of God much blasphemed, and I feared greatly lest I should catch the horrible infection. I thought if I sinned again after having life and death set before me, I should certainly go to hell. My mind was chagrined. He says, I murmured much at God's providential dealings with me. Why was I saved? Why was I enslaved? Why was I tied up? Why was I allowed to let go? Why was I cheated? He says, I hated all things at one point and wished I had never been born. Confusion seized me and I wished to be annihilated. And then he has a vision. The vision is of Calvary. The vision is of a crucified Savior bleeding on the cross. And he says, I saw the Lord Jesus Christ in his humiliation, loaded and bearing my reproach, sin, and shame. And therefore, here you have the apocalyptic shift, where he accepts religion, he accepts the preachings of the Anglican Church, he accepts the missionary zeal, he accepts the forces that are going to shape the rest of his life, that are going to lead him, regardless what the consequences may be, to approach the Queen, to approach government officials, to approach the leaders of Sierra Leone, to show no hypocrisy, and to demand rights for human individuals. So you have this vision. William Blake saw the vision too. Pope Paul, before he died, saw the vision. That is, people with this great zeal will accept and understand and see the vision of their Savior in a way that reverses the hypocrisies that they have faced in the past, and at least put them on a path where they don't return. This is, again, the story of Pilgrim's Progress. You've got to move forward, and you can't backslide. Now, I want to spend a few moments talking about the economics of the book, because, after all, the slave trade is an economic verity. Slaves were traded for barrels of rum and bales of tobacco. Their price was assessed in terms of what they could bring in production. And one of the features of the slave trade was an interesting verbal communication. All men are born free and equal, right? But slaves are not born free, therefore they're not equal. So those who supported the slave trade used as the argument the fact that these words don't apply to slaves. They were not born free. The problem was to get over this hurdle of the birth of slaves and recognize them as human beings. But for the most part, it's the economics of the slave trade that we're going to look at for a few moments. When he discusses his life in Africa at the beginning of the narrative, he talks about what it is that his family gained when members married. And here's what they get. A dowry is given to the new married pair, which consists of portions of land, slaves, cattle, household goods, and implements of husbandry, butter churns, and farm tools. So slavery is considered chattel, even in his own African nation. Afterwards, the wife is esteemed the sole property of her husband. He talks about the richness of his country and the products that were sold. We trade for firearms, gunpowder, hats, beads, dried fish. People barter with us for our odoriferous woods, our mahogany. The only slaves, he says, we sold were prisoners of war. He talks about the richness of his land. We have plenty of Indian corn, vast quantities of cotton and tobacco. Our pineapples grow without culture. They're about the size of the largest sugar loaf and finely flavored. Last time I think you could buy a pineapple for $3.88 in the Houston supermarkets. Wonder how many pineapples one must sell to support a slave for a year. When a trader wants slaves, again, how do you get slaves? When a trader wants slaves, he applies to a chief for them and tempts them with his wares. And then, of course, the chief will try to meet the demands of the slave trader. When you look at Equinos' book, and I think while you have only chapter 5 in your text to look at, it's the kind of book that you can sit down with in a couple hours and cover it and give yourself a complete sense of its emotions, ranging from the sights of people hanging upside down to the values one achieves by hiring slaves who work cooperatively in the slave trade, to the kinds of goods that slaves are exchanged for and the goods for which slaves are equated. His concern is survival. And on 3 occasions, you have shipwrecks, you have slaves unable to get food, you have the only concern amongst the slaver is his profit. And as the years passed, and people began to realize, perhaps more so with industrialization than any other reason, the folly of the slave trade, by the time the Industrial Revolution was moving into full gear, the slave trade was on its way out. There are not a lot of tales so brilliantly told or so emotionally ordered as Equinos' narrative, and it's one of the books that spans the culture of England and America and lets us know how this country developed and how its philosophy evolved. Thank you.